Last week, time of recording, Wyrd Games just announced their 2023 Rotten Harvest box set. And before we get into the details, one might ask, what is a Rotten Harvest? At face value, it would seem that the Rotten Harvest set is just another alternate theme box for Malifaux. However, to think that Rotten Harvest is just a alternate Halloween-themed box for Malifaux would be a critical understatement. Yes, that's right. Once you start asking the hard-hitting questions like, what is a Nightmare box? What is a Rotten Harvest box? What are Twisted Alternatives? What is Iconic Series? Now you're at the doorstep of understanding. Now you are at the foot of the very breach itself. Matter of fact, what is the role of an alternate sculpt? What makes a good alternate sculpt? And if I'm walking the discussion this far back, will I ever make it back around to the 2023 Rotten Harvest box in specifics? Find out after this intro. Welcome to Corner Case, the channel for wargamers by wargamers. You're in the hobby corner with me, your host, your man of 1,000 faces, and, as it turns out, your best friend, Deck. You see, generally on this channel, I have been very vocal about my stoke for Wyrd Games' approach to alternate sculpts. I think, out of any game, company, whatever you want to call it, Wyrd has been the most liberal and creative with their alternate sculpt approach. In fact, let's take a look at some alternate sculpts from across the wargaming sphere. I have before you now the Humble Games Workshop Primaris Lieutenant. Is this considered an alternate sculpt? There's about 50 of them. Actually, I don't think so. While I think this is the closest thing I can think of to an alternate sculpt within the 40k universe, Primaris Lieutenant variant, I think in practice, it's really more like a kit bash to your army. It's really just like, Primaris Lieutenant is to Space Marine Army as a Power Sword kit bash is to Space Marine Sergeant. It is just a personalization. The Primaris Lieutenants generally don't tell any specific stories. They're not usually named. They're not characters normally. There are a few, but I think generally speaking, they're more of a blank canvas for you as the player to customize. And I imagine that's what GW would like for that model. If we head on over to the world of Infinity, we can see that Corvus Belli offers multiple types of alternate sculpts. Since Infinity is the models are monopose, alternate or limited edition sculpts usually come in the form of just like a different weapon loadout or different pose. You can see here this alternate Guija is holding the sword in a different hand, has a different gun than the normal model. So this type of alternate sculpt appeals to people who really care about that WYSIWYG. Infinity also has a type of proxy that ties in with their Aristea game, and I think these are really great because Aristea, the game storyline, occurs at least a couple, I don't know the specifics, but a couple years before the mainline Infinity storyline. So when you proxy in models from Aristea when you use basically the Aristea models as a proxy or an alternate sculpt to their Infinity counterparts, usually those characters are looking younger. They may look more action-packed or, I have on screen here the Soldiers of Fortune. I think they're like the coolest example. Proxying these models in kind of has like a narrative value. It kind of invites the player or the collector to know more about the world, get invested in the character because they have like a familiarity with that character over a longer period of time. And Aristea offers another type of alternate sculpt, which is what they call skins. I have on here the Automata Parvati in comparison with the mainline Parvati and the Infinity Infinity Parvati, and I kind of can't help but think that the Automata skin, it's hard for me to not think that they had Malifaux in mind. And so finally, we come to Wyrd's portfolio of alternate sculpts, and to simplify this conversation, I've put up here a small chart. So first, we have models that come from Wyrd's other game, Army Scale game. The other side, but they are usable, counts as within Malifaux the game. So that kind of invites players to cross systems, collect models that are usable for both. There's like a little bit of value play there. Next, you have Malifaux's Nightmare models, Nightmare boxes, which I think are a little bit better known. We've talked about them on the channel before, and at face value, they look like a mixed bag. But in actuality, many of the Nightmare boxes tie into Wyrd's Through the Breach tabletop RPG game. So these Nightmare boxes, you can think of them as Through the Breach models that have a, that counts as, that are playable within Malifaux, the game. So pretty cool. Next, you have Malifaux's iconic models. Now, these, of most of them that have been released, have been portraying a important or an important or cool moment within that character's story. The kind of outlier right now is Lady Justice, who currently, her iconic model is portraying a kind of like Marvel what if. So that's pretty interesting. And the iconic models, interestingly, come with both a 75mm display piece and a playable 28mm model. So very interesting product here. But before I get into Rotten Harvest in specific, I want to summarize what I like about all these alternate sculpts that Wyrd offers. And the big idea is that Wyrd kind of uses alternate sculpts to invite people to partake more in the weirdo sphere, as I'm calling it. The cross-compatible models between the other side and Malifaux, even though they don't share specific characters, specifically calling it out as a proxyable counts as model kind of invites that cross-compatibility. Try both games. The tie-in with the Nightmare models. Not only do the Nightmare models look super cool, but they kind of invite you to, like if you buy the 1988 box, you might be curious, like what does Through the Breach into the Logic Engine TTRPG module play like, so it invites you to try that. And finally, the iconic models, it kind of services the collector and the hobbyist with a 75mm display piece, invites people to be interested in the lore a little bit more, and at the same time still provides you with a playable model. So I think that is a super interesting product, and I think more games should be creative about inviting players to partake not only in other games that they have, but specifically in the lore, in the world that they have built, because that's ultimately, I think, what keeps people interested in a game. So Rotten Harvest, I've begun to think, is actually the most interesting of Wyrd's alternate sculpt lines. Now, I will say when it first dropped, that first, Pandora Rotten Harvest box, I just thought, okay, this is super cool. Like all the models look sick. I need this. But I wasn't super surprised because, Wyrd has been festive in the past, Easter specific models like Easter Victoria, Easter Angelica, Winter Wonderland, that alternate Raspy crew. So the festive thematics has been a part of the world. Wasn't so surprised. And even when the Zoraida Rotten Harvest box dropped, I also wasn't super surprised. But it wasn't until last year, 2022's Dia de los Muertos Rotten Harvest box was announced that, I kind of put it together. Something a lot more interesting is happening here. See, the first two Rotten Harvest boxes look like they're kind of along the same vector of just like Halloween art direction, but when the Dia de los Muertos box was announced, it kind of like broke the mold and said like, no, this isn't just generic Halloween stuff. This is a whole ass Spookyverse, and kind of like with 2023's announcements of the It's Alive kind of Frankenstein's monster themed box, that kind of, to me, kind of cements the idea of the Spookyverse. It's alive! So one reason I really like this is because when you try to explain to a new player, like what genre is Malifaux, you toss out all of the keywords because you're saying it's like a low fantasy, steampunk, weird Western horror game, and I could even toss out more, but like the Rotten Harvest series kind of cements that like the core genre of this game, at its heart, it's a horror game. The next thing that I really love about the Rotten Harvest series is it takes kind of the pageantry, the pointed and juicy art direction of the Nightmare box, and it blows that up across, a whole series of models, not just a single box. You take the 1980 Malifaux 1988 box, you take the Brines and Bones box, and they're like polar opposites. You got your cyberpunk, you got your pirates, like everything from the model, the sculpt design, the details to the graphic design, the packaging, everything is super, super different. So Rotten Harvest takes that, and not only does it execute a really juicy art direction across a single keyword Rotten Harvest box, but there's there's kind of a through line through all of the Rotten Harvest boxes, and as they start to build more, eventually you can field a game that is only Rotten Harvest boxes, and you can battle for the Spookyverse. Now, for those of you who have stuck with me this far, I have a conspiracy about, what these Rotten Harvest boxes are and where they're going. And that conspiracy theory is Lon Chaney. That's right, Lon Chaney, man of 1,000 faces. Here's an image of Lon Chaney Sr. in The Unknown, aka Dia de los Muertos. Here's an image of Lon Chaney Jr. in The Ghost of Frankenstein, aka 2023's It's Alive. See, once you start to think of the Rotten Harvest series as actually the Lon Chaney-verse, then it all starts to fall into place. Here is Lon Chaney Jr. in The Wolfman. Here is Lon Chaney Jr. in The Mummy's Tomb. Here he is in The Son of Dracula. So obviously these are going to be the next Rotten Harvest boxes, right? And then you remember that Lon Chaney also starred in Dracula versus Frankenstein. So now you realize Rotten Harvest is actually a long con to get Malifaux players to be fielding Rotten Harvest versus Rotten Harvest, aka the movie that Wyrd always wanted but never got, Dracula versus Frankenstein versus the Wolfman versus the Pumpkin Lady. Chaney-Verse, baby. And that concludes my I'm really excited for the Rotten Harvest box, and I hope you guys are too. It's alive, and so am I. Thank you again for watching the video. If you made it this far, please like and subscribe. We super appreciate it. Leave in the comments whatever the heck you're thinking. We love to hear it. Thank you to everyone on the Discord. Join the Discord. Thank you to everyone on the Patreon. Take us to the money zone, baby. I'd like to extend a big corner case thank you to all of our supporters on Patreon. You are what make this channel possible. And an extended thank you to everyone who supports the channel in non-monetary ways. Building community is absolutely the best part of the hobby. Back to the show.